Thank you. Hello, Tucson. Good to be here. I appreciate this opportunity to be here in Tucson and also to be a little bit out of the cold for a little bit. When we were talking about dates for the lecture, I think Ed first mentioned May or something. I said, can we work this out a little bit? And so we decided to do it in February, and so I'm delighted to be here. To be able to jog outside rather than to work out inside today was a great treat, and I really appreciate that. I thought I'd say a little bit tonight about the election in 2016. Some of you remember that election. And in particular, try to solve the riddle, or the apparent riddle, how it was that 81% of white evangelicals, who for the past 40 years have been talking about family values, voted for a thrice-married, where do I go here, individual who is a self-confessed sexual predator. How is that a family values vote? And I have to say that I've been puzzling about this for a long time, ever since election night. And so to provide some context, I want to provide a bit of historical context. First of all, I'm going to perhaps insult the intelligence of some of the folks here, and I don't mean to do that, by talking about what it is to be an evangelical, to define an evangelical. I use a three-part definition. An evangelical is somebody who believes that the Bible is God's revelation to humanity, the Bible consisting of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. So they take it very seriously to the point of literal interpretation, from Genesis and the account of creation all the way through the book of Revelation and the apocalyptic prophecies that they find there. Having said that, I always want to qualify that by saying that evangelicals engage in what I call the ruse of selective literalism. They are not strict literalists in any stretch of the imagination, so they interpret certain parts of the Bible very seriously and very literally, but they do take the Bible very seriously as God's revelation to humanity, and that's their understanding. The second general characteristic of an evangelical stems from the first part of the definition. An evangelical is someone who believes in the centrality of a conversion or a born-again experience. This comes from the third chapter of St. John in the New Testament, when Nicodemus, the Jewish leader, visits Jesus by night to ask how he can be admitted into the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus replies, according to the King James Version, "You must be born again." Other translations have it as "born from above." But this is where the term born again comes from the third chapter of St. John in the New Testament. For most evangelicals, this is not only a transformative experience, it is a datable experience. Many evangelicals will provide an account, if you ask them, about their conversion experience or their born-again moment. I was in hospital on June 17th, 1982, about to go in for surgery. The woman in the next bed, or the person in the next bed, asked me to pray with her. She read from the Psalms, and I decided to ask Jesus into my heart. I decided to be born again. I decided to be saved. Those are all relatively synonymous terms for this born-again experience. For evangelicals, it represents a translation from sin to salvation, from death into life. And so it is a very important moment for them. The third part of the definition is an evangelical takes seriously the mandate to evangelize, or to bring others into the fold. This comes from the end of the Gospel of St. Mark in the New Testament, when Jesus commands his followers to go into all the world and preach the gospel, baptizing in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Again, I want to qualify that a little bit. My observation over the last half century or so is that evangelicals talk about doing that a great deal more than they actually do it. Increasingly, they hire professionals to do it for them, whether it's missionaries or, say, an outreach pastor in a megachurch or an evangelism minister or something like that. But at least ostensibly, an evangelical would claim the responsibility for evangelism, trying to bring others into the faith. So those three definitions: somebody who takes the Bible very seriously as God's revelation to humanity, someone who believes in the centrality of a conversion experience, and then finally someone who believes in the mandate to evangelize or to bring others into the faith. That is a fairly rough definition, and I have to say, I'm not going to get into this, but within that broader rubric, you have many different strains or divisions. I sometimes compare evangelicalism to General Motors, in that you've got this big corporation, and then under General Motors, you have GMC trucks, you've got Buick, you've got Pontiac. I think Oldsmobile is gone, but upon a time you had Oldsmobile, Chevrolet, and so forth. Those are all divisions within General Motors. So too with evangelicalism. You have evangelicalism writ large, and within evangelicalism you have Pentecostals, people with their arms in the air in a gesture of openness to the Holy Spirit, people who speak in tongues, believe in divine healing, and so forth. Fundamentalists, who tend to be the most militant strain of evangelicalism. So-called neo-evangelicals. A friend of mine describes neo-evangelicals as anybody who likes Billy Graham, which is not a bad definition. The holiness movement, and I'm not going to get into all these technical definitions, but only to say that within evangelicalism you have many, many different expressions, many different strains that go into that movement. How large is this movement? Again, polling data are very difficult to wrangle in many ways. The best efforts, rather consistently over the last several decades when I've been tracking this, is that somewhere between 25 and 46% of Americans would fall into that general category of evangelicalism. So it's a large number. I think the true number probably is more like 33%, a third of the population would fit into that category. So that's a general definition of evangelicalism, and let me just scoot back into history a little bit and talk about some of the characteristics of this movement as it has manifested itself in American life. Evangelicalism, as we know it today, would trace its history to the Protestant Reformation and even farther back to the evangelists of the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are called the evangelists, the writers of the gospel. But in America, I think evangelicalism came about with a confluence of what I call the 3 Ps. Puritanism, Scots-Irish Presbyterianism, and a movement from the continent called Pietism, which was a renewal movement within Protestantism, very similar, for example, to Wesleyan Methodism, also similar to Hasidism, in that it emphasized not merely intellectual assent, but a warm-hearted, affective piety. And what happens is these 3 movements come together in American history in an event that historians call the Great Awakening, roughly the 1730s and 1740s, a colonies-wide revival that convulsed the Atlantic seaboard in the middle of the 18th century and produced in my judgment, a very particular strain of evangelicalism that we find here in America. This was refined in another revival that took place at the turn of the 19th century that historians rather unimaginatively call the Second Great Awakening, which convulsed 3 theaters of the new nation. New England, the Cumberland Valley of Kentucky, where you had a lot of the camp meeting revivals, and then finally the upstate New York area that became known as the Burned Over District because the fires of revival swept through that region so frequently. And it's in this last part of that Second Great Awakening that I want to spend a little bit of time so you can understand evangelicalism. What comes out of that particular theater of the Second Great Awakening in the early part of the 19th century is a social reform movement whose parameters may surprise you. Today, when we think about evangelicalism, I expect most of you would talk about the religious right, or what some people call the Christian right. But if you look back farther in American history, you see that evangelical activism and evangelical social reform took a very, very different form. What happens is that out of that region in upstate New York, and it spreads much beyond that. But that was the real genesis. There was conviction on the part of many American evangelicals that we could bring about the kingdom of God on earth by dint of our own efforts. That is, we could reform the country according to the norms of godliness. And this conviction animated some of the remarkable social reform efforts of the 19th century. For example, evangelicals coming out of that Second Great Awakening, this series of revivals, said, we don't think slavery is consistent with our understanding of the kingdom of God. And so they worked for the abolition of slavery. Another example, some of you know from American history, in Weehawken, New Jersey, in 1805, there was a duel between Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, and Aaron Burr, Vice President of the United States. Alexander Hamilton was mortally wounded in that duel, the gunfight between these two individuals. You thought Dick Cheney was the first American vice president to shoot somebody. Happened a long time ago. Many evangelicals, particularly Lyman Beecher, said, this is barbaric. We're trying to build this godly kingdom here in America. Dueling should have no place in that sort of godly kingdom. And so he, along with others, launched this reform effort to outlaw dueling, which by the middle of the 19th century had been successful. Peace crusades. Evangelicals were active in trying to avert war. They protested, for example, the Cherokee removal. They also protested the war with Mexico as inconsistent with godliness in this world. Evangelicals were also involved in education, the common school movement. Many of the pioneers of that movement, in addition to Unitarians, people like Horace Mann, but many evangelicals were very involved as leaders at the state level in common schools because they understood public education as a way to allow those on the lower rungs of society to advance up into the middle class. Evangelicals were also active in prison reform, the whole idea of a penitentiary, where you send a criminal not merely to segregate him from the rest of society, but send him to a place where he could become penitent and thereby constructively rejoin society at another point. Evangelicals were very active in that. Women's rights. Women's rights in the 19th century, particularly voting rights, was a fraught issue. Evangelicals were in the vanguard of the movement to provide equal rights, including voting rights, for women in the 19th century. And recently I also learned that evangelicals in the antebellum period in particular were very, very skeptical of capitalism. Capitalism. Charles Grandison Finney, by any measure, the most important evangelical of the 19th century, said, or at least offered the hypothesis, that a Christian businessman was an oxymoron because business and commerce necessarily elevated avarice over altruism. Those are my words, but that was essentially his argument. So the picture, if you look back in American history of evangelicalism, particularly evangelical social reform, looks very, very different from what we've seen over the past half century, and this is where I'm going with my remarks today. What happens? Well, what happens is a lot of things. I don't have time to get into all the details. The Civil War breaks out. All of a sudden, this nation that was supposed to be the seat of the kingdom of God on earth is warring against one another. In a terrible carnage, scholars are now thinking that the casualties of the Civil War approached something like 750,000. Compare that to Vietnam, tragic as it was, 58,000 Americans lost their lives, soldiers lost their lives in Vietnam, 750,000 in the Civil War. Also, you had, after the Civil War, massive urbanization, industrialization, the influx of non-Protestant immigrants who didn't share evangelical scruples about temperance, and all of a sudden evangelicals begin to have second thoughts about whether or not they were actually constructing the godly kingdom here on earth. Fast forward ahead, I'm sorry to be so quick in doing that. The Scopes trial in 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee, which pit William Jennings Bryan, the three-time Democratic nominee for president, against Clarence Darrow, the famous Chicago attorney, over the issue, at least ostensibly, of the teaching of evolution in the public schools, although Bryan's real reason for being skeptical about evolution was the fact that he feared the kind of Nietzschean Overman notion that was implicit in social Darwinism. That was his real concern. Nevertheless, what happens in the Scopes trial is that William Jennings Bryan, of course, is discredited, and afterwards, evangelicals begin to retreat into their own world. I'm going to say a few words about that here in the next couple of minutes. What happens after the Scopes trial, and the Scopes trial is a rough marker, but it's certainly an important one, is that evangelicals begin to think that the larger culture had become hostile, had turned against them and their interests. This was after the 20s, the Roaring 20s, the Flapper Age, and so forth. But the Scopes trial, among other things, including political divides in various Protestant denominations, persuade these evangelicals that they no longer had control of the culture. And so what they do, beginning in the 1920s, really through the 1970s or into the 1970s, they withdraw into their own world, what I have called the evangelical subculture, which was this vast and interlocking network of institutions, Bible camps, Bible institutes, churches, denominations, seminaries, Bible colleges, Bible institutes, if I said that already, I may perhaps did, publishing houses, missionary societies, so that it was possible in the middle decades of the 20th century to grow up within that world and have very, very little commerce with anyone outside of that world. And I can speak to this personally, but I won't do it right now. Perhaps later, if you want to prompt me, I will. This was the evangelical subculture, and it was a defensive posture against what was seen as the corrupting influences in this larger world. It also meant that evangelicals were not politically active. Many were not even registered to vote. They had given up on politics as this kind of seamy world that could do no good for them. Instead, they wanted to maintain their own purity within the subculture, within this network of institutions. So roughly from the Scopes trial of 1925 until the mid-1970s, evangelicals were not engaged politically. And then we come to the 1970s, and here's where the story begins to unfold in detail. What happens in the 1970s is first of all, there is a gathering of 55 evangelical leaders in the YMCA on Wabash Street in Chicago over Thanksgiving weekend in 1973. And they draft a document called the Chicago Declaration of Evangelical Social Concern. And I invite you to read it for yourself. If you do a search on Google, you can find it. Make sure you put 1973 into that search. But what's remarkable about that document is the extent to which it reiterates many of the same social concerns that I just have outlined for you for evangelicals in the 19th century. This document decried the persistence of racism in American society. It also decried this growing gap between the affluent and everyone else in American society. It decried the persistence of hunger in an affluent society. It talked about the dangers of militarism in American life. This was, of course, at the end of the Vietnam War, so it was very much in the minds of many people at that time. Not that it shouldn't be at other times as well. And it also reiterated evangelical support for gender equality, for women's rights. Within 6 months of that document, an event takes place down in Athens, Georgia, at an event called Law Day at the University of Georgia Law School. Law Day at the University of Georgia is a big deal. The graduating class invites very prominent individuals to come and address them, usually Supreme Court justices or senators or attorneys general. On this day, the keynote speaker was the senator from Massachusetts, Edward M. Kennedy. And the undercard speaker, right after Kennedy gave his address, which was about the impeachment proceedings then proceeding through Congress for Richard Nixon, the undercard speaker followed him, and this was the governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter, who talked about his own understanding of justice. And he talked about two theological influences that he had had that helped him understand the importance of justice. One was the great theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who famously said that the sad duty of politics is to establish justice in a sinful world. This is a quote that Jimmy Carter has repeated many, many times over the course of his career and his life. The second theologian he cited was the great and venerable theologian Bob Dylan, and particularly his song, Ain't Going to Work on Maggie's Farm No More, that talked about the plight of tenant farmers. Carter went on to talk about the importance of justice, talked about some of the things he was doing as governor of Georgia to try to redress the great disparity in the Georgia prison population, which incarcerated a disproportionate number of people of color. He also talked about corruption in Washington, the scandal that so many of the regulatory agencies in Washington were staffed by people who represented those corporations who were being regulated and so forth. In the midst of his remarks, he noticed one of the journalists attending the gathering slip out the back door and then come back a few minutes later. And at first, Carter thought that Hunter S. Thompson of Rolling Stone magazine was merely going out to refresh whatever adult beverage he was consuming that day. Turned out Hunter Thompson was going to his car to retrieve his tape recorder to record something extraordinary. As he later said, a politician willing to tell the truth, a politician willing to speak about matters of justice and corruption. What happens, of course, you know from American history, is that 6 months after that, in December of 1974, Jimmy Carter announces his candidacy for the Democratic nomination for president, and then begins his remarkable rise to the Democratic nomination and being elected president in 1976. What happens then is the rise of the religious right. Now, we all know the story. Evangelicals were so utterly scandalized by the Roe v. Wade ruling of January 22nd, 1973, that they decided suddenly to give up their political somnolence and organize politically so that they could overturn this great moral outrage of the Roe v. Wade ruling in 1973. Some of these evangelical leaders have even gone so far as to characterize themselves as the new abolitionists, trying to draw a moral equivalence between their opposition to abortion and the activism of antebellum evangelicals against the scourge of slavery. It's a great story. It's been repeated many, many times by people like Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, Ralph Reed, Tony Perkins, you name the players. It is also utter fiction. In 1968, before the Roe ruling, the flagship evangelical magazine, Christianity Today, together with another evangelical organization called the Christian Medical Society, convened a conference to talk about the ethical issues surrounding abortion. They met Over the course of several days, theologians read papers, they debated the issue back and forth, and at the end of the conference, they issued a statement saying, gee, we really don't know about the ethical implications of abortion, but we think it probably should be allowed. In 1971, the messengers, or the delegates, of the Southern Baptist Convention, hardly a redoubt of liberalism, meeting in St. Louis, Missouri, passed a resolution calling for the legalization of abortion. A resolution they reaffirmed in 1974 after the Roe ruling, and again in 1976. When the Roe v. Wade ruling was handed down, several prominent evangelicals, including W.A. Criswell, pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, claims to be the largest Baptist church in the world, issued a statement applauding the Roe v. Wade ruling. I call this the abortion myth. Abortion had nothing to do with the formation or the mobilization of the religious right. By the way, I say this on the basis of probably a decade looking through the sources and trying to nail this down. What happened? Well, it was a court ruling, yes, but it wasn't the Supreme Court, and it wasn't Roe v. Wade. It was a court case in the district court for the District of Columbia in a decision handed down on a case called Green v. Connolly, and the decision was handed down on June 30th, 1971. Now let's step back. The background for Green v. Connolly was both the Brown decision of May 17th, 1954, and the Civil Rights Act that Lyndon Johnson signed into law on July 2nd, 1964. As schools, public schools were required to desegregate, many so-called segregation academies began to spring up. One example was down in Holmes County, Mississippi, where in the first year of desegregation, the number of white students, don't quote me on the number, but I have it roughly correct, the number of white students in the public school system dropped from 740 to 28. The second year of desegregation in Holmes County, Missouri, the number of white students in the public schools dropped from 28 to 0. At the same time, 3 segregation academies were applying to the Internal Revenue Service for tax-exempt status. And several families in Holmes County, Mississippi said, this doesn't smell right to us. And so they contested the granting of tax-exempt status to segregation academies. And this is the case that, when joined with another case, became Green v. Connolly and was decided by the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia on June 30th, 1971. And in that decision, the court said, in effect, any organization that engages in racial segregation or racial discrimination is not, by definition, a charitable institution. Therefore, it has no claims on tax-exempt status. The Nixon administration then instructed the Internal Revenue Service not to grant any more tax exemptions to such institutions. And the IRS began to make inquiries into some of these suspect institutions to ask about their racial policies. One of the places that was queried was a fundamentalist school in Greenville, South Carolina called Bob Jones University. And Bob Jones University said, in effect, yes, we segregate. The Bible tells us to segregate. Leave us alone. Well, it didn't exactly work out that way. The IRS starts coming after Bob Jones University and other places, and finally, on January 19th, 1976, after years of warnings, the IRS rescinded the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones University. That marks the beginning of the religious right. People like Jerry Falwell, who had his own segregation academy back in Lynchburg, Virginia, got together with people like Paul Weyrich, who had been trying to get evangelicals engaged in politics ever since the Goldwater campaign of 1964, but had failed. They got together and said, we have to do something to resist this. And this is how the religious right started, as a defense of racial segregation. The paradoxes start mounting. The religious right organized to defeat a fellow evangelical, Jimmy Carter, in the 1980 presidential election. And their designated champion was Ronald Reagan, who, when asked if he was a born-again Christian, said, well, I'm not sure what it means, but I guess I qualify. And even then, in that campaign, and I've spent a good bit of time in the archives, the presidential library in Simi Valley. Even during the campaign, the Reagan-Bush campaign was not sure about the issue of abortion. Some of you may remember on August 22nd, 1980, Ronald Reagan addressed a huge gathering at Reunion Arena in Dallas, Texas, about 15,000 evangelicals. And in that speech, he talked about creationism, he talked about general moral decay in American society, several other issues, including tax exemption for evangelical institutions. He didn't even mention abortion. How did abortion become part of the agenda of the religious right? This is an issue that I've been chasing down for a long, long time, and I think I finally got it. Paul Weyrich, actually, it's a longer story, I don't want to get into it. I met him at a conference in Washington in November of 1990. And he made a statement in the course of the conference that abortion had nothing to do with the rise of the religious right. And he's the guy who formed the movement, essentially. And he was quite emphatic about that, and I wanted to make sure that I understood him correctly, so I went to him after the session, and I said, I just want to make sure I understand you correctly. He said, absolutely not. He said, I've been trying since the Goldwater campaign to get evangelicals mobilized and interested in politics. I tried pornography, I tried the school prayer issue, I tried the equal rights for women issue, I tried abortion. Nothing got their attention until the education or the schools case came up. That's when they finally got interested in politics. And then I was able to look at it a little bit more. Paul Weyrich's papers are in, of all places, Cheyenne, Wyoming, at the University of Wyoming. And so I went through his papers and found, in fact, the moment when he discovered that abortion was going to work for him as a political movement in order to get grassroots evangelicals interested in politics and voting Republican. So what happens in 1980, of course, is that evangelicals abandoned one of their own, Jimmy Carter, Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher, for Ronald Reagan, who, by the way, as governor of California, had signed into law the most liberal abortion bill in the country. And at that point, then, the religious right or evangelical voters begin to cast their lot with the Republican Party. I sometimes call this the secularization of American evangelicalism. American evangelicals had once been concerned about issues of religion and social reform, as I plotted out for you, but they increasingly submerged those interests into the agenda of the Republican Party, which included such issues as the abolition of the Department of Education, cutting down on benefits for the poor and so forth, welfare, and that sort of thing. And this is what transpired over the course of the 1980s. In 1981, Billy Graham, by any measure the most important or certainly the most famous evangelical of the 20th century, said this to Parade magazine: "I don't want to see religious bigotry in any form. It would disturb me if there was a wedding between the religious fundamentalists and the political right. The hard right has no interest in religion except to manipulate it." And yet what we've seen since 1980 has been the movement of the religious right into the Republican Party, so much so that the religious right has become the most reliable constituency of the Republican Party, much the way that labor unions once were for the Democratic Party. And so we've come around finally to the 2016 presidential election. I think the 2016 presidential election represents the religious right abandoning all pretense of interest in family values. If I ever hear the term family values again, I'm going to scream after what we saw in November, and simply return to the origins, the founding origins of the religious right itself, which was founded in racism. And so they embrace not only a thrice-married casino owner, you add whatever you want to add to that description, but someone whose appeal to voters derived almost entirely, or at least in great measure, from his appeal to racist sentiments. The religious right, evangelical votes in the 2016 election represents the chickens coming home to roost. And I find it a great tragedy because you have the eclipse of this great and noble tradition of concern for those on the margins of society. Suddenly, well, not so suddenly, but over the course of the last half century, being discarded in favor of political access. I believe that religion always functions best from the margins of society and not in the councils of power. Because once you begin to hanker after political power, you lose your prophetic voice. And I think the story, the sad story, the tragic story of the religious right illustrates that. Thank you for your attention.